Unless you're a sociopath, you probably try to figure out, in some cases anyway, what's the right thing to do here? What's the ethical thing to do here? And then you go through some kind of deliberative process to figure out what's right and what's wrong. Now, I want you to suppose that we need to understand how we do that sort of thing, or what's the best way to go about doing it, because we might one day, in fact, that day may be here, arguably, we might have to teach AI how to engage in ethical inquiry or ethical deliberation to figure out what's the right thing to do here. So if we can get a grip on how we do it or how we ought to do it, maybe then we can get a grip on how we ought to train AI to engage in it as well. So that's what the conversation with Cameron revolves around. And I want to draw attention before we get into this conversation to a distinction that is really important, that looms very large in our conversation. And I want to highlight it here because it's not that straightforward to the non-philosophers among us. So here's the distinction. The first way that you might think about engaging in moral deliberation or ethical deliberation, I'm going to use morality and ethics interchangeably, is that you've got these principles, and you take these high-level principles: don't kill innocent people, don't torture people for fun, don't steal things. You take those high-level principles, and then you apply them to particular cases. So, should I do this? Well, this is a case in which I would be stealing something. I've got this general rule that says don't steal stuff, and so I guess I shouldn't steal this thing. That's what Cameron calls a rationalist approach. You might call it a principlist approach, something along those lines. And it's very much top down. Here are those principles up on high, and now we apply them to particular cases. That's the rationalist approach. What Cameron calls the empiricist approach, some people might call the particularist approach, is forget about those high-level principles. What we're doing when we are engaging in moral deliberation or ethical inquiry is we're trying to figure out, in this particular situation, should I do this or should I do that? Is the fact that she went last time relevant here? Is the fact that it might cause some pain a reason for not doing it? And it's going to vary case by case. Now, one thing that we do when we're growing up is our parents will say, no, that's not the right thing to do. Don't take that toy from her. That's hers. Or alternatively, no, you should share. So we get this feedback from our parents and other loved ones, whoever raises us, feedback on particular cases. And so that when we keep getting this feedback of, yes, share, no, don't rip that toy out of her hands, we start getting into the habit of acting in that kind of way and thinking things like, oh, sharing is good, ripping things out of people's hands is bad. I mean, that's obviously a gross oversimplification, but you get the point. It's very feature or sort of case specific. And one thing that we're learning to do, arguably, in these kinds of cases is we're learning to pick out what you might call morally relevant or morally salient features of a situation. So, for instance, suppose that, as happens with my children, we play a game most nights, and our kids switch on and off who gets to pick what the game is going to be. And the fact that she went last time is relevant because we have an agreement that they're going to alternate back and forth. So the fact that she got to choose last time is relevant or a salient feature of the situation to why my son gets to choose tonight, as an example. On the other hand, the fact that she's wearing a blue shirt, completely morally irrelevant, not a morally salient feature. So what we're trying to do in many cases is we're trying to pick out the morally salient, the morally relevant features of the situation to figure out what we morally ought to do. And notice that people can screw this up in all sorts of ways. You can fail to think that something is morally relevant when in fact it is. And you could think something is morally relevant when it's not. So the case of thinking that because she's wearing a blue shirt, that means it's her turn to pick. That's not a morally relevant feature. And then, of course, there are immoral ways of taking things to be ethically relevant when they're not. For instance, the person's race. There are cases of discrimination where the fact that they're black or the fact that they're Asian is taken into account in the deliberations when it really ought not to have been taken into account. Okay, so we got these two pictures. Picture number one, high-level principles applied to particular cases. Thou shalt not steal. This is a case of stealing. Better not steal here then. Versus, oh, I've been told in this case and in this case and in this case, not to do this thing or to do this kind of thing, and sort of extrapolating from that. So that's more bottom-up as opposed to the rationalist top-down. Okay, that's one thing to say. Second thing to say, and there's going to be three things in total, broadly speaking. The second thing to say is you might wonder about how do we get impartiality? When we engage in ethics, and ethical inquiry, and ethical deliberation, we're trying to be impartial, right? If it's just sort of trying to figure out how I can get the most for me and mine, that's not ethical inquiry. That's, if you like, selfish inquiry. So there's a degree of impartiality to ethics. How do we achieve that level of impartiality? And here again, those two ways of thinking about ethical inquiry track to two different ways you might think about impartiality. If you're the rationalist or the principlist, you're going to think that what makes the deliberation impartial is that you're starting your deliberation from these impartial principles. So the principle is something like, don't steal. That's an impartial principle. Here's a partial principle. Don't steal unless you read. That would be a very partial principle, not a very good one for ethical inquiry. So the way you get impartiality from the rationalist or principlist approach is by applying impartial principles. How do you do it then if you're this more bottom-up empiricist approach? Well, as Cameron says, and this just comes from the moral theory of Adam Smith, who you may know as an economist, but he was also a great moral theorist, what you do is you take the perspective of other people. You engage in an act of empathy with the other people in the situation. Well, how is he or she thinking or feeling about this? How is he or she thinking about this? And you sort of go through all the relevant people that are involved or relevant to the situation, and you think about their interests and how they're thinking and feeling about the situation to come to, so that this sort of taking on their various perspectives allows you to create an informed conclusion about what you ought to do. And it's the impartiality comes in that I'm not just, if you like, empathizing with myself, just thinking about what I want. I'm also thinking about what others want in the situation. So it's by virtue of empathizing with other people, by taking on their viewpoints, that we attain a certain degree of impartiality. So that's another sort of important picture that is getting drawn out by Adam Smith, courtesy of Cameron. All right, so you've now got two pictures of ethical inquiry, the rationalist and the empiricist, or the top-down versus the bottom-up, and you've got two different pictures of impartiality. And we haven't even started talking about AI now, so now here's the third thing that I want to talk about. How do we apply this to AI and training an AI to engage in ethical inquiry? So here's how. If you take the principlist approach or the rational approach, the top-down approach, then you are going to think we need to get these ethical principles that we give to our AI. So we tell our AI, don't steal, don't lie, don't kill innocent people, so on and so forth. And then you expect the AI to take those general principles and apply them to particular cases. If, on the other hand, you think that's implausible, as Cameron does, and as actually a lot of people do, it's very hard to come up with these very high-level principles that apply in all cases. It's not clear what to do when those principles conflict. You might think instead that the way to train an AI is through this bottom-up approach. So the AI acts in various ways, or it's given certain kinds of scenarios, it says how it would act, and then you say thumbs up, thumbs down, something along those lines. At least that's how it starts. And the AI then learns, okay, here's how I should treat these kind of situations. What you are doing to some extent is you're starting to train the AI how to pay attention to, or how to identify, morally relevant or morally salient features of the situation. Now, what's interesting is that there's an extent to which we already engage in this thumbs up, thumb downs work with AI. We have what's called reinforcement learning. And so AI acts in various ways. When ChatGPT was being trained, it gave certain kinds of outputs, and then reviewers of the outputs would give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And it learns from that how to do better. So we're already engaged in reinforcement learning with AI, and this is, if you like, another layer of it where the feedback is not merely thumbs up, thumbs down, but for instance, thumbs down because the fact that she's in pain is relevant for why that action shouldn't be taken, or the fact that she went last time, given the prior agreement that we're going to take turns here, that's a morally relevant feature of the situation, and so on and so forth. So what you're supposed to be training the AI to do is to take on the perspective of other people in the situation, or at least model what their emotions are and what their thoughts are, so that the AI can not just see those different perspectives, but can use those different perspectives as grounds on which to make particular moral judgments. And what we're trying to do here is train up the kind of AI that habitually takes on other people's perspectives and thus impartially decides what it ought to do. Okay, so that's a lot of machinery, but that's the background, or it's the sort of, if you like, the terrain that Cameron and I cover, and I wanted to give you that heads up so that you see where we're coming from. So again, very quickly, three things. There's the top-down principled versus bottom-up particular case way of engaging in ethical inquiry. There's two different perspectives on what constitutes impartiality, applying impartial principles versus taking on the perspectives of different people in the situation. And then there's applying that to AI with Cameron's strong preference for thinking that the principlist approach for AI is not going to work. In fact, it's not really how it works for us human beings. And we really need to take this more fine-grained, bottom-up empiricist approach in order to get AI to be ethical. Okay, I know that was a lot. I hope that made sense. And you're going to get more of that in my conversation with Cameron, and you'll get more meat on the bones. So super, super interesting and fascinating conversation. And also a nice way of highlighting the ways in which moral theorists can help us to think about how do we get morally sound AI. In terms of housekeeping, as always, please go give this podcast a 5-star rating, share it with your friends, tell everyone about it. Otherwise, you're just stealing. And, here's me giving you feedback. Don't steal my podcast. Don't steal it. Just, pay for it by telling other people about it. That's it. Low price. No big deal. Okay. Thanks so much, as always, for listening, and enjoy the conversation with Cameron. All right, Cameron, from what I gather, you think there are really two pictures of how ethics gets integrated with AI. And one picture is, if you like the old picture, then you've got the sort of newer picture. So first of all, do I have that right? And secondly, if that is right, can you sort of spell out or outline what those two pictures are?
Yeah, that's right. So there's two ways of thinking about approaches to artificial morality, getting robots that can make moral decisions. There's kind of top-down, traditional, I'll use some philosophical terms also, rationalist approach, where the idea is to make a decision in an ethical way, is to follow the rules, right? Where the rules are these highly abstract principles. So example might be like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or in philosophy,
Sure.
there are other examples like Kant's categorical imperative act, so that you universalize your decision and make sure that everybody could follow it consistently. Or the principle of utility, act in a way that you maximize the happiness for the most people all the time. And then the idea, according to these approaches, is that to act morally is to act in a way that's in accordance with these abstract rules.
I think they could be more fine-grained, right? Like, if you find yourself in a situation in which someone knocks on your door asking if, you're hiding Jews in there and the person is a Nazi, you can lie. Right? That's
right.
not exactly fine-grained, but the principles don't have to be super general. They just have to be principles that say, in such and such a situation, do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I take it that the picture of how we get robots to be, when you say, you said robots, I'm also wondering if you mean AI more general.
Yeah, AI more general.
Okay. In order to get it to behave or ethically or give ethical outputs, you've got to program these principles in.
Right. Yeah, I was actually going to bring up the example of, lying to a murderer to save someone later, because that's notoriously a case where the rationalists look like they might give the wrong answer to the question unless you sort of complicate the view. I think the picture I'd rather work with is, instead of this dichotomy between either you're reasoning according to abstract all or nothing rules, or everything is this, and I'll characterize the other view later on, this kind of bottom, particular context-driven way. There's a bunch of views in the middle there, where you allow for some exceptions. You maybe can balance off different principles against each other. I think the more exceptions you have and
Sure.
the more complicated you make, the more you get closer to the sort of bottom-up approach.
So I take it that one of the problems with trying to get machines or AI to be ethical by virtue of a rule-based approach is that either the rules are going to be extremely articulated at such a high level that they don't actually guide,
Right.
or they're going to have to take into account exceptions to the rule, context, what you do in cases of conflicting principles,
Right.
and that's going to be phenomenally difficult. In fact, I
Right.
think it's just impossible to program
Right.
that.
And it's a classic plot device in sci-fi, right? Asimov's 3 laws and
Exactly,
iRobot,
yes.
right? What goes wrong is they discover an inconsistency in the 3 principles they were programmed. They try to kill all the humans, right? It's a classic sci-fi
Right.
device, but also something we might really worry about if we don't allow these robots to sort of learn to navigate very complex, dilemma-ridden situations where just following the rules might, it seems like, lead you to the wrong answer.
It seems like it seems like a bizarre way to start, because there's no human that goes around engaging in ethical deliberation in that fashion. So why would we think, okay, listen, we want to, something like recreate or at least functionally recreate how humans engage in the world ethically? Let's create a system that that gets to the conclusions in completely different ways than any normal human being does.
We can all see the allure of this approach also, right? Though the thought is that to be maximally impartial is to be moral. And in order to do that, you have to act in a way that you're just not affected by any kind of bias or emotion. It's a very powerful kind of enlightenment picture of what rationality is, that you just kind of do cold
Hmm.
calculation to figure out what the right answer is. But
Yeah,
that's explicitly the picture of morality that I want to contrast. And indeed, some of the biggest criticisms of it are that it just doesn't get human moral psychology right. That's not, in fact, how the vast
sure.
majority of us could reason, even if we wanted to.
Yeah. Okay, so what's the other picture? What's the alternative picture that you find
Yeah.
A more
Yes.
I guess more A is more appealing, but also because it more accurately reflects what ethical deliberation looks like, but also I take it you think it's a more pragmatic picture because it's more implementable into AI.
Right. Yeah. Especially there's a nice fit with machine learning. So the other approach you might call the bottom up approach, a more empiricist approach, which is where you're trying to learn how to act ethically from processing experiences, right? In particular,
Okay.
interacting with the world and interacting especially with other social agents and getting feedback from them about what's appropriate or inappropriate to do in certain circumstances. And then abstracting from that to learn more general behavior patterns. We would call them virtues, right? Where you're sort of
Mm.
calibrated in a way that you're reacting to others in a morally appropriate way. This is the more empiricist approach, and they call it in this tradition the sentimentalist approach. It's really associated with the work of Adam Smith, who most people know as an economist, but in the day he was, more widely known as a moral theorist and moral psychologist. One of the big things that's missing from the rationalist picture, and that is really emphasized in this sentimentalist empiricist picture, is that emotion is part and parcel of what it is to be a moral agent, right? So it's not something that you need to screen off. It's rather something you need to cultivate so that you're guiding your emotional passions and your affective sentiments in a way that is reflective of a mature, praiseworthy individual in your cultural situation, right? Someone who is, showing anger in the right situations, but also showing affection in the right situations and showing pride or shame or whatever in the appropriate situation, rather than trying to act like a cold calculation device that doesn't have emotions or perspectives at all.
So there's two things going on, or at least two things going on that I want to pull apart. One of which I sort of understand, the other of which I don't. The thing that I understand is okay. Listen, ethics is highly context sensitive. You gotta know who you're talking to, who they know, who they're friends with, who their parents are, or various kinds of morally relevant features of the situation that you need to know in order to act rightly. How are you going to give computers or AI that kind of knowledge? Well, you're going to roughly allow them to act in various ways, probably put in certain kinds of constraints to begin with, so it doesn't start sort of like killing and then asking, hey, was that okay? But so you put in certain kinds of constraints and then you give it feedback. This just sounds like regular reinforcement learning for machine learning, right? You're just telling, yes, that was the right thing to do. No, it wasn't the right thing to do. And so I get this reinforcement learning picture and why
Hmm.
that would be appealing because it allows or it's the process by which the AI becomes sensitive to context. So at least in principle, I get that. What I don't get though is how this connects up to anything having to do with the sentiments or the emotions. Since after all, and then you talked about virtue ethics, one thing that you're doing, well, there's different ways of cashing this out, but one way to think about it is that it's the emotions or the emotional capacities that give you access to the moral facts to because you're emotionally constituted in a certain way, you can get to know what's good and bad and right and wrong. Another version is if you've got the right emotions, then once you know the right thing to do, you're inclined to do the right thing.
Hmm.
But of course, at least right now, in the foreseeable future, AI doesn't have emotions to do any one of those things. So why not just stop with the sort of reinforcement learning thing? Stop there and say we're getting ethical behavior. Why go on to say, and what we need are the emotions or the sentiments in order to interact or enable or access morality for robots? That seems way too high of a bar.
Whew, that's a big complex question. So there's a lot of aspects to the question that you have. So we are in fact already pursuing this reinforcement learning based approach. In fact, most of the advances that we've made with chatbots, especially in the last year, are a result of various forms of reinforcement learning on human feedback, or it sometimes gets called sentiment tuning or preference tuning, where what they do is after they pre-trained the large language model to, predict enormous amounts of text on the internet, they then put it through further rounds of training where they try to give it feedback from real humans. So it is actually already socially interacting with humans in exactly the kind of way the empiricist would think would give it the way to improve its decision making to be more socially acceptable or praiseworthy.
Sure. So the idea is something like we train the LLMs, OpenAI trains the LLM, then you get people interact with it in various ways. It says stupid or inappropriate things, and then the programmer, whatever their role is, says, no, 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 that's not the way to respond to that. That's insensitive. That's inappropriate. That's offensive. Avoid that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
you do that with dozens or hundreds or thousands of people interacting with the model, it'll better learn what's appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Right. But up until now, it's been a very simple evaluation, right? So different companies have tried different things, but you might get like a 10-point Likert scale for just helpful versus harmful, right? Or you might get just a simple thumbs up, thumbs down. Did you like it or dislike this response? And the thought is the social feedback that humans give one another, especially in moral development, is much, much, much richer, right? And so this is in part where I think the cutting edge of AI could actually learn a lot from the sentimentalist philosophers, because they talked about a whole range of ethical virtues, honesty, bravery, being a good friend, generosity, spending money wisely. And they talked a lot about the development of those virtues in a course of moral education all the way down from childhood, right? And so I think connecting up the machine learning at the cutting edge today with reinforcement learning from human feedback and fine tuning to all of this rich work from the sentimentalist philosophers who are reflecting on exactly what virtues do we want to cultivate to create an ethical person and exactly what kinds of formative experiences cultivate those virtues, I think could give engineers a lot more ideas on how to make a machine that would be better fitting and able to predict what the praiseworthy human response would be for a much wider range of situations, right? So one thing that's a common complaint about the large language models when you interact with them, for example, is they don't seem to have a stable personality, right? Or they have a very artificial personality that seems kind of hacked into them or forced into them by the programmers. You try to get ChatGPT to do various things and it'll say, I'm sorry, I'm a chatbot programmed by OpenAI and I can't do that. That's just part of like the implicit prompt, that it was explicitly kind of whacked so that it couldn't do certain things. But then you go through a longer dialogue and you try to find it displaying kind of like a consistent set of personal values or individual perspective or have kind of like long-term consistent preferences. And it just jumps around back and forth kind of inconsistently without recognizing the mistakes. And the thought would be that if we start actually training these systems to think about responding appropriately in a much more multidimensional way, and they can learn to fit the situation they're in based on cues that are given to them by the human that they're interacting with or aspects of the situation they're in, they will be able to produce much more flexible, context-sensitive approaches that are much better fits to what humans think are a praiseworthy thing to do in a situation. Right? So, if you're in a situation where this is not an ethical example, but like if you get cues that you need to be brief, it can be brief. If you need cues, you need to be verbose, it can be verbose. If you're getting cues from the situation that this is a place where you should, for example, try to be exceptionally generous, you might be exceptionally generous. And if you're getting cues that you should now be a little bit more hesitant, you'll be more hesitant. That's things that are very very difficult to capture just on a single unimodal feedback, right? Helpful, harmful. You're not going to be able to get all of those subtle gradations. So one of the things I'm trying to suggest is that, it's a basic reinforcement learning approach, but it needs to be much more multidimensional and complex, the types of feedback you're getting and the types of almost like personality traits and virtues that you're aiming to cultivate in the system.
Yeah, so there's so much to say here. So one thing to say is I don't yet understand the role that the sentiments or the emotions are playing. I take it that you're not saying something like, we need AI to have emotions or sentiments in order for it to engage in ethical behavior. You're not saying that, correct?
They don't need to really
And so,
have them. They need to model them to a certain degree, I think. So that there's a fine, like, what do you think is really essential to an emotion? If you think it needs to have a conscious experience, for example, then you might think none of the systems
yeah,
that we have right now could have a conscious experience of being
that's right.
angry or being afraid. But that's not necessarily what they need to
Yeah.
model to learn to cultivate the appropriate responses. They just need to know, when would a human be
Mhm.
angry or afraid or what.
I don't see why you don't just jettison all the sentiment talk. I don't
Yeah,
see
I
why you
think
don't just say, all right, listen, there's this generalist picture where you get these big principles and you wheel them in to engage in moral deliberation, and that picture fails. What we need is a more fine grained contextual approach. You know, I would say if I were an academic philosopher still, I'd say what you're talking about is particularism. So particularism is the view for, those people who are not in the sort of 0.1% of people who study ethics or meta-ethics and academic philosophy. It's the view that you don't need principles to engage in moral reasoning. Rather, you pay attention to particular features of the situation.
Mhm.
Yes, part of moral education is becoming sensitized to those particular features, but there's not a big story to be told about the emotions or sentiments. And I think that kind of picture seems more amenable to the thing that you're talking about. You don't Why do you need the sentiments? Why do you even need to talk about the sentiments as opposed to just being attuned or sensitive to morally relevant features of a situation, which you get by virtue of human trainers, as it were, saying, yes, that's morally relevant. No, it's not morally relevant. Yes, it is morally relevant and it's extremely salient and weighty. Yes, it's morally relevant, but it's not particularly salient and weighty. That
Mhm.
kind of feedback gets the AI system to be more sensitive. And we can stop talking about consciousness or sentience or sentiments or emotions.
So where all the empiricists are trying to get to is to cultivate a faculty of empathy, right? Where we can see things from another person's perspective. They think that that's going to get them to, because they don't, it's not that a particularist or a sentimentalist thinks that, say, the impartiality that a rationalist wants to get to is irrelevant or not really an important part of moral reasoning. They think that you're going to get to impartiality rather through developing a mature faculty of empathy. Now, you like the points earlier about reinforcement learning, and you say, yeah, these models can do reinforcement learning, and that seems like a good way to achieve moral decision making in this particular method. And what I'm suggesting, it is a theory, there are other theories, but one theory about how you build a faculty of empathy from very basic reinforcement learning mechanisms is by cultivating sentiment, right? In particular, you practice putting yourself in other people's shoes, right? When you're considering moral situations. So you might think, I would respond to the situation in this way. But is that only because I come from a particular background or I'm a member of a particular demographic group or because, my parents had a certain amount of money? And then you, through experience with other people and seeing their reactions to the sentiments that you display or the judgments that you display in various situations, you learn other people might not react to the same situation in the same way, or they might even regard what you did as, being blameworthy or somehow incorrect or biased in a certain way. As you get that feedback, you learn to more successfully predict how other people from different backgrounds would react to or view, or, what's their perspective on the situation that we make. By gradually learning that. So what Adam Smith and Sophie de Grouchy were both kind of aiming for is what they call the impartial spectator view, right? Where you learn eventually this way of engaging the faculty of empathy so that you care about all of the people involved in the situation, but you do so from a kind of perspective that's ultimately stable to changes of idiosyncratic viewpoints, right? Where you're learning, I need to control for differences in socioeconomic status or differences in demographic background or differences in education so that my judgment should be viewed from the broadest reflective sense as being the appropriate judgment for the impartial spectator to give in these types of situations. And that's what I'm suggesting has been missing from this discussion all along, from either the empiricist or the rationalist perspective, at least as it's applied to AI, is how do you start from the very basic
So,
reinforcement learning mechanisms and then gradually bootstrap those up to this mature, impartial spectator type perspective from which you can get judgments that are going to look a lot like the right judgments you would get from a top-down abstract moral rule theory.
okay, so now there's a lot of machinery going on now. So let me see if I've got this right. This is sort of my attempt to sort of summarize all this and encapsulate it. So step one is something like, okay, these big principles, the rationalist view, forget that. We're not just going to have these sort of big principles either loaded in the human mind or loaded on the AI mind, quote unquote, that's going to get us or them through successful moral deliberation to figure out what's the thing to be done here. Okay, that picture's no good. One reason it's no good is that the world is too complicated for those big principles to provide the kind of fine-grained guidance that we need. Okay, so then we move on to step two, which is something like, listen, the way that we actually get attuned to the morally relevant features of the situation is by feedback from our parents, our friends, our family, whatever, saying, yes, that's what you should do here. No, that's not what you shouldn't do here. Maybe that's why, here's why you should or shouldn't do that. And so we sort of, it's sort of, I don't know if this is quite a good analogy, but maybe it'll suit our purposes for a general audience. It's kind of like the rules of grammar. We don't learn the rules of grammar and then start speaking English grammatically. We talk various ways, then we get corrected in the way that we talk. That's not how you say that. And then we just learn how to speak better, even though we weren't not doing it because we've got these big grammar rules in our heads. In fact, I barely know any grammar rules. But we learn how to form sentences in the right sort of way by virtue of the kind of feedback that we get. Okay. So I get that. That's the alternative picture. There's sort of two more things going on, I take it. One more thing that's going on is one of the things that you're learning to do when you're getting all that feedback is you're learning to see things from the perspective of another.
Mhm.
So like, as an example, this is your claim anyway, I think. When my son, who's 5, hits my daughter, who's 8, because he's frustrated about losing the card game or whatever, and my wife and I say, no, don't do that. That's not nice. That hurt her. You need to say you're sorry. The claim goes, what we're doing is we're teaching him to empathize with her so that he'll come to see the wrongness of it.
Exactly.
Okay. So I've got issues with that, but that's the claim anyway.
Mhm.
And so now we've gone from learning about which features are morally salient through feedback to the claim that what enables us to see why all those things are morally salient or morally relevant in the way that they are is our capacity for empathy.
Mhm.
So now we need AI to have a capacity for empathy if it's going to learn moral judgments or ethical judgments in the way that humans do.
Mhm.
And then you have another step to take, which is something like, well, hey, listen, what you don't want is only empathizing with white people and not empathizing with black people, as an example of biased empathy. So you don't want biased empathy. You want, as you would say about judges, disinterested empathy. You want empathy that's unbiased or objective or something like that. And that's what's the word? Indifferent spectator?
Impartial spectator.
Is that the phrase?
Yeah.
Impartial. Thank you. So what's the
ideal
right thing to do in a
spectator
given
sometimes.
situation? Yeah, ideal spectator, sure. So then the question, so what do you want? What's the right thing to do? Well, the theory is the right thing to do is what the person who empathizes with all impartially would do, or something along those lines.
Mhm.
Yeah? Or
Right.
do I have that right? Is that the big picture?
You got the picture, yeah.
That's a hell of a picture. Okay. Okay. That's a hell of a picture. I mean, there's lots of things to say here. One thing to say is I'm not sure that I'm teaching my kid to be empathetic. I mean, if I say something like, don't hit your sister, that hurts her, I might be teaching him the fact that she's in pain is morally relevant. I don't know that I'm telling him to, if you like, imaginatively occupy her position and imagine what it might feel like to be hit like that for the reason that you were hit. I think there are lots of situations where I say, like, that's unfair. And I'm not sure that I'm asking, if Billy, went off, started 10 feet in front of me in the race, and I say, that's not fair. I don't think I'm exercising my capacity for empathy. So one issue is that I just think that there's lots of cases in which we make ethical judgments where we're not engaging our capacity for empathy.
Mhm.
I think it's neither necessary, it's probably not sufficient either. But even if it were sufficient to exercise empathy in order to make a moral judgment, I don't think it's necessary. One thing to say. The other thing to say is that I have no idea how we would get an AI to occupy the mind of another. Even if we give it all that sort of feedback, I don't think it gets it to the point of being empathetic, which I conceive of as something like the imaginative reconstruction of another being's experience. And then of course, there's issues about impartiality and whether the impartial judgment is always the ethically right one. For instance, I should be partial to my children and I should give them preference. And I should be, if I have to go down with empathy, I should be more empathetic to my children's plight than the plight of others, because it's my duty as a parent to prioritize their pain and suffering over the pain and suffering of others. So I don't know. There's a bunch of stuff to talk about what you want to talk about.
Yeah, so the sentimentalists were aware of all of these types of critiques, and there's lots of responses in literature
Of
back and
course.
forth.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, just to respond to the last issue that you raised, is that impartial doesn't, again, mean non-caring, and it doesn't even mean that you don't occupy a particular perspective in the situation. It just means that on reflection, even taking into account differences in starting position and things that we think ought to not be morally relevant, the impartial spectator would still say that kind of preference is like, okay, according to the standards that you've been taught in your culture. So I think most of the sentimentalists would agree that you could show certain forms of partiality towards your own children as long as it didn't, violate some other more important concern in the situation, right?
Okay.
Because they're your kids, and that's a kind of thing that every member of the society might be able to understand and regard as a morally
Okay, fair
relevant
enough. Yep.
feature of the situation. Can you remind
Yeah.
me a couple of the other points? You threw out about 4 in once.
Yeah, sorry, I went on a bit of a rant. Yeah, one is that I don't think that empathy is necessary for moral judgment.
Yeah,
It
sure.
might be,
Yeah.
it might feature in lots of cases, but there's lots
Yeah.
of cases in which I don't think empathy is at play at all.
Yeah, right. Great. Yeah. So the sentimentalists also didn't say that, empathizing every single time you make a moral decision was required for you to be praiseworthy or not. In fact, that's why they emphasize things like habit and virtue, where you're sure, of course, most situations, you're just kind of responding to behavior patterns and signals from your environment. Where empathy is really going to show its worth are in these cases when you're in kind of a novel situation. And these are exactly the sorts of situations that are especially hard for machine learning. So why bother with all of this instead of just going with a very simplistic reinforcement learning based approach where you're just responding to particular cues in particular situations and learning what the morally relevant features are? The reason is the morally relevant features are really, really hard to recognize. They're deep things like moral worth and suffering and things like that. And they might show up in lots of different ways in different situations. My thought is that it's especially in these really difficult inferential situations where a faculty of empathy might show its worth, where you have to really think. Like, so suppose you care a lot about animal welfare, right? And you're wondering, is it ethical to eat octopus, right? None of the surface cues that you might have been trained on from other instances of moral regard with others are going to be present in the case of the octopus. And you're going to have to try to reason from these higher principles, try to put yourself like, what would it be like to be an octopus? Do the octopus feel pain when you cultivate them and cut off their limbs and stuff to serve them up in a restaurant? Maybe that's the kind of feature. And you're expecting that to show up in lots of other places in human decision-making too, exactly where you think doing the right thing might be especially hard for an agent. You see all these cases for the really difficult cases of moral change, where what eventually happens, there's this great story. I'm trying to look up the guy's name really quick. Yeah, Daryl Davis. You know the Daryl Davis type story? So he's a African-American blues musician who managed to convert hundreds of Ku Klux Klan members, right?
Oh, yes, I do know that story. Yes,
He has this collection of all the robes. The thought would be the way that you really get these people to project empathy appropriately to people that they previously regarded as not moral agents or not worthy of moral regard is by spending a lot of time with them and building these kind of links so that they can start to put themselves in the shoes of other people. That's a very long, slow learning process that you can't do just by saying, don't they feel pain or something? That's not really how it works. They have to actually interact with people over longer periods of time so that they can see things from their perspective. And the thought is that's really what makes it motivationally significant for people to be able to project very different kinds of cases.
Yeah. So let me ask you 2 questions. One is, I take it that it's an empirical claim that the way that people learn is through these kinds of feedback mechanisms. So one is that I think that's just an empirical claim that that's how we learn.
Yeah, it is for sure.
I'd have to imagine that I'm not totally sure that that's the right story. I imagine a lot of the story has to do with the models that we have, right? That we model behavior. So people think, people do as other people do, not as they say. My kids, you're right. You can tell your kids, you can scream at your kids, be nice, and beat the shit out of them, and insisting that they be nice to other people, but probably what they're going to learn is not to be nice, but how to be cruel and to be
Mhm.
cruel. So
Right.
I'm not sure. I wonder how robust or how well supported the empirical claim is that kids learn morality through being told what to do through there's feedback
That
thing.
kind of punishment doesn't teach empathy, right? It doesn't teach them to be able to put
Uh,
themselves in the shoes of other. It teaches them that they get themselves get negative feedback if they do certain particular things. So they don't do those particular things, but they don't cultivate a mature moral judgment as a result of it. I would say that's sort of like why corporal punishment maybe doesn't work.
yeah, but the point wasn't about corporal punishment. The point was more that I can say, "Hey, listen, you should really be generous to people, and it's because they're suffering and blah blah blah." And then my kids notice that I'm actually never generous to people, right?
For sure.
And then they in turn are not generous. And so there the issue is not the failures of corporal punishment due to lack of empathy. I'm just wondering about what is in fact, I mean, there could be multiple causes, of course, right?
Mhm.
It could be both that humans, when they do learn to engage in legitimate, that is to say, empathy-driven moral behavior, part of the story is that they've been given certain kinds of feedback. This is right. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
wrong. Here's why you
Mhm.
do this. You should empathize. But I also think a causal contributor is
Mhm.
they're modeling the kinds of behavior that they see at first their parents engage in, and then the kinds of behavior that their friends engage in, and the
Mhm.
kinds of so I wonder how much modeling or how much living up to the example that's been set before them. I might even, it might even be the case that this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, maybe I tell them the wrong thing that I think is right,
Mhm.
and then I don't act in accordance with it, right? So
Yeah.
I tell them because I've been raised in the deep South during slavery, black people are inferior. It's like you should really. But then they see that I treat black people well, and then they model my behavior, and that's better. So anyway, this is just me saying I'm wondering the extent to which your picture relies upon a model of moral education that is, if not inaccurate, at least to put it strongly, impoverished because it doesn't take into
Mhm.
account we learn moral behavior. We learn how to be good people by watching other people and seeing what they do and emulating them. That's one bucket. And then, okay, I'll stop there. And then I have one other
Here,
comment or one other question.
yeah, the mentalists again, they knew all this, and that's why they emphasize so much moral education as opposed to innate moral principles or innate faculties of empathy. They said these are things that you have to cultivate. And if you're born into kind of perverse incentive structure or with bad exemplars, you're going to turn out to be a vicious person. And that's not a failure of the ethical view. That's just how people work. But precisely these cases where you talk about you see that somebody tells you to do one thing, but then they act in another. This is exactly the kind of thing that I think the mature, as you develop this faculty of empathy, you learn to recognize those instabilities and inconsistencies, right? That's exactly what you do when you're seeking the impartial spectator perspective. The way I look at it is what you're looking for is the judgment that is like maximally stable across all of the different perspectives. That is, remains the praiseworthy thing to do from the perspective of the impartial observer when you try it out from all kinds of different starting points. And this is the way that a lot of these, the real big ethical epiphanies, again, are the places where I think this would shine, where, you have the very bright child who's starting to think and he's like, gosh, the way my parents taught me to behave. When I think about it from these other ways, I don't get the same answer. It no longer seems like the right thing to do. I don't know what to do anymore. And then they start, looking for a deeper, more consistent, more authentic way to respond to this full range of situations where they can have a consistent self identity and set of values that works across all of them as opposed to creating all these conflicts. Again, I would explore the conflicts as conflicts amongst sentiments, but maybe you want to push back and say the conflicts are
Hmm.
somewhere else. But I really do think that this
Yeah.
stability is exactly why empathy is so important in achieving the mature moral perspective. And again, in moral education,
Yes.
which is emphasized again and again by the empiricist sentimentalist philosophers, precisely what you're supposed to help a child do in that education is explore lots and lots of different perspectives and see how things that they thought were the praiseworthy thing to do or the blameworthy thing in certain situations actually look completely different from a different perspective. And that gives you the pressure to find a better perspective.
So we could probably talk about this for I'm going to say another 6 to 12 hours. But I'm going to ask you a different kind of question to wrap it up. Suppose I buy the story. Yep, this all sounds right. Totally empathy, impartial spectator, on board. Okay. I guess the last question is something like, how pragmatic is this in terms of how companies actually operate? I mean, if you've got,
Hmm.
literally, dozens, if not hundreds of people giving it feedback, and we know that people engage in all kinds of moral disagreements,
Hmm.
I'm not sure. Are we going to get the required kind of unity of feedback that we need in order to get the
Hmm.
AI to where we would need it to be? I mean, I'm raised by my parents. I have a certain moral view. It's a very small circle. That circle starts to expand. I get some friends, but it's still a relatively small circle of feedback. It's not, and of course, I prioritize some people over others. I'm like, yeah, Danny's my friend, but like he's got a bit of a screw loose, and so I don't take his moral advice too seriously. I don't take his moral feedback too seriously. Maybe that's conscious, maybe it's not. Whatever. I guess my question is, if we've got hundreds, dozens or hundreds of people giving feedback to the machine, and I'm assuming it's not just racist trolls like we had with Microsoft Tay back in 2016. Is it going to be sufficiently unified? That is to say, is the feedback going to be sufficiently unified such that you're going to get something like a coherent moral view that the AI could
Hmm.
get to? Or is it going to be kept giving conflicting advice? And so it's just sort of, it's a fractured soul, the poor AI.
Yeah, yeah. Again, huge multifaceted question. So I'll start with one thing that is relevant to companies. I think. So one thing that people have noted, because I'm not the only one to suggest this kind of sentimentalist approach to fine-tuning AIs, is that it would allow for a kind of cultural variability that you might want in systems that you're going to deploy. So just a quick example, suppose you were a company that was developing caregiving robots and you wanted to build chatbots into them so they could interact with people in a care facility. You might actually want them to have different virtues and different sentiments based on whether it's in Japan or it's in, Georgia, right? For example, you might want to emphasize things
Sure,
like
yeah, of course.
deference and more shame-based responses in Eastern
Yep.
culture, and you might want to emphasize more like individual liberty and virtue type responses in the American South. But there is a deeper moral problem that showed up for all of the sentimentalists, whether you're interested in AI or not, is could we actually achieve a kind of perspective above even the ideal observer in
Sure.
particular cultures, right? Where we can not just learn to act in a way that's most people in my culture would regard as praiseworthy, but now even judge the practices of the culture itself. I think that remains an open empirical and philosophical question, whether we can achieve that type of perspective from the types of feedback that we've been talking about. But I think you're not going to be able to do it unless you do try to model some sophisticated empathetic reasoning that allows those type of epiphanies that I was talking about earlier, right? Where the
Yeah.
system itself could maybe learn to sort different types of feedback that it gets. But you would hope, I don't have the solution here, right? Like if I had the algorithm, I would go give it to all the companies and save the world and get rich. But you hope it's got to have something to do with stability. And there's all kinds of technical ways of pre-processing data where you try to figure out which data is reliable and which data is noise or junk by trying to check it for consistency, right? And this is a suggestion of one other type of consistency you could look for, right? Is when I put myself in the perspective of this user, do they give consistent judgments to different types of situations that I regard as morally the
Yeah.
same, right? Whereas if it looks like,
Yeah.
according to the abstractions I've derived so far, that this is the same type of moral situation, but this user says this is good and this is bad, then that might be a reason to kind of
Yeah.
downvote their feedback for training.
I suppose another thing that you could say, or that I'll say in your defense, is you could say something like, yeah, there might be times at which the AI manifests contradictory moral views or moral judgments or moral feelings or something along those lines. And that's just what we'd expect. Why would
Yeah,
we
yeah,
expect? That's what we get
yeah,
with humans. Humans have
yeah,
all contradictory views, beliefs, feelings.
yeah. I was going to add this too. So suppose you really are in a situation where the culture, or it looks like the relevant moral principles don't give you a consistent answer. You want the AI to be like uncertain or fail to give a really highly confident verdict in those cases. And you could
Sure.
even think of using that for decision-making purposes, where it looks like it keeps trying from lots of different perspectives and keeps getting different answers. Maybe you want it to deliberate more or seek out more information from others. The sentimentalists also talk about lots of cases where the differences in moral perspective are due to just factual differences, right? Where once you get the factual
Sure. Yeah.
differences right, now the judgments are all consistent with one another. And so if it can't achieve a stable answer on some particular case, that might be one where you want to actually use that lack of an easy consensus to seek more information or just defer it to a human. If you ever did let these things make autonomous decisions on their own, you would also want them to know when they shouldn't be confident in their decision and they should maybe defer to someone else or ask for more information.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. All right. On that note of agreement, we'll end it. Thanks so much. This has been really, really fascinating. Thanks very much.
Okay, cool. Thank you.